Hello friends, my name is JJ. So, the United States welcomes more immigrants than any other country on Earth, which has resulted in basically all of the world's cultures having some sort of presence within its borders. On the one hand, this makes America an amazingly educational place, where curious folks can sample little snippets of all sorts of global traditions and learn about the practices of the wider world through immigrant ambassadors. But on the other hand, the practice of bringing foreign cultures to America can also result in them getting a little bit distorted over time. Cut off from their birth country, immigrants, and especially their children and grandchildren, may gradually start to lose touch with the home country and start to practice their old world customs in a way that bears increasingly little resemblance to what their parents or grandparents did. As they become more Americanized, they might likewise update or modernize their traditions in a way that seems more consistent with the tastes and preferences of the American majority, particularly if they are involved in the business of selling their culture in some way. And of course, there is also the infamous practice of what we now call cultural appropriation, where Americans from outside of immigrant communities take it upon themselves to take over or improve some immigrant cultural thing that they may broadly like, but still feel needs a few tweaks. All of this adds up to what I am going to call the phenomenon of Fauxthenticity, which is when a cultural item or practice in modern America has a pretense of representing some foreign or old world tradition, but is instead a thoroughly unique American thing. To be clear, I do not think that this is a bad phenomenon. In fact, Fauxthenticity can be an inspiring manifestation of the great American melting pot, where endless immigrant cultures swirl together and create new, distinctly American cultural traditions. But there can be no denying that Fauxthentic stuff can be quite confusing as well, or even slightly deceptive if not understood in its proper context. So let's give that a try. If you've ever been to a Chinatown in the US before, you've probably seen one of these things, a Chinatown gate. The style is a great example of a certain sort of Fauxthentic architecture, a design that is supposed to look Chinese, but isn't based on any actual Chinese tradition. Instead, it is a style that mostly white architects dreamed up as they rebuilt San Francisco's Chinatown after the earthquake of 1906. That obviously seems a little bit condescending, but in the century since, the style has been happily embraced by Chinese Americans all over this continent, including here in Vancouver, as something that's authentically theirs, even if it may not be all that authentically Chinese. Vox did a great video about this recently that you should totally check out.
It didn't look like China, but it didn't have to. The point was to make Chinatown a built-in feature of the city and a hub of not just trade, but tourism.
But of course, architecture based on relatively ill-informed cultural cliches is nothing new. You could even say that the entire city of Washington, D.C. is a monument to Fauxthentic sensibilities, given the number of prominent buildings done up in a style designed to evoke ancient Rome and Greece, as part of the larger American project to set up a government in the style of ancient Rome and Greece. And critics would say that neither the buildings nor the political system was all that faithful to the source material. So-called ethnic holidays are a similar story. Cinco de Mayo, or May 5th, celebrates Mexico's 1862 defeat of the French army of Napoleon III in the Battle of Puebla. It was an event that had a lot of geopolitical significance at the time, but is now mostly forgotten, especially in Mexico itself, where the anniversary isn't even an official holiday. The fact that May 5th has nevertheless somehow wound up as America's preeminent celebration of Mexican pride makes it a good example of this sort of phenomenon we're talking about. You have a day dedicated to celebrating Mexican culture, despite being of limited importance to actual Mexico, meaning that basically all of the associated festivities and traditions are purely American in origin, which is fine, because at this point, American Chicano culture certainly has plenty of traditions that Mexicans in Mexico can't necessarily relate to, but deserve celebration just the same. Where things get problematic is when festivities drift so far from even Mexican American culture that you're left with little more than Cinco de Drinko. St. Patrick's Day is quite similar. It had a long history as an important religious holiday in Ireland, but it was the Americans who came up with the idea that it should be this big extravaganza of Irish cultural pride. In fact, the wild thing is that unlike Cinco de Mayo, St. Patrick's Day actually became a bigger deal as America's ties to Ireland grew weaker, with parades and parties continuing to grow throughout the late 20th century, even as America's population of first-generation Irish immigrants immigrants continued to shrink. Perhaps for this reason, the version of Irish culture that is celebrated on St. Patrick's Day has become notoriously faux-authentic, with a focus on things like green beer and green rivers and shamrock shakes and corned beef dinners and pinching people who aren't wearing green and all sorts of other things that they don't actually do in Ireland. But the Irish don't seem all that offended. In fact, Irish authorities eventually grew envious of the American take on St. Patrick's Day, and beginning in the 1970s, tried to re-import the American version of their holiday, often by explicitly consulting American St. Patrick's Day experts. Today, St. Patrick's Day has become a big deal in Ireland as well, but it did take a while for it to fully catch on. I like this quote here in this book about the history of St. Patrick's Day.
By marching down Fifth Avenue and elsewhere, Americans and Canadians with an Irish lineage renewed their ties with an Ireland they conceived as home. For the Irish themselves, St. Patrick's Day, so long as it sought to copy North American celebrations, would be a comparatively empty experience. How do you celebrate home when you're already there?
The most classic example of faux authenticity, however, has got to be food. One of the big jokes about American culture, in fact, is that if a food has some foreign land in its name, it's pretty likely that people actually from that foreign land either won't recognize it or will be slightly offended by it. It's really quite remarkable how many common foods Americans explicitly identify with some sort of foreign adjective were things that were actually invented in America to embrace some imagined foreign standard of quality, as opposed to a legit foreign tradition brought to America. Some noteworthy examples would include Swiss cheese, which as Americans know it, is a knockoff version of what the actual Swiss call Emmental cheese, Italian ice, which is a distinct American evolution of the Italian dessert known as granitas, English muffins, which are an American take on the British crumpet, French roast coffee, which is a name that apparently arose from an old American stereotype that all Europeans drank their coffee super dark, and Russian salad dressing, which as far as I can tell simply gets its name because it was something Americans in the early 20th century figured Russians might eat. And then there's the super confusing story of German chocolate cake, which was named after an American brand of chocolate, which was named after an American guy named Sam German, who was not actually German, but it still got bound up in a certain sentimental idea of Germany as the land of chocolate, alongside Black Forest cake, which also has a super confused origin story, but does seem to be at least a little bit more authentically German. Less on-the-nose examples would be the many foods that American culture classifies as belonging to a foreign cuisine, even though they were invented in the United States. Chop suey would be the ultimate faux-authentic dish, something that feels very exotic and even has an exotic sounding name, but as most Chinese people know, was actually invented in America for Americans. There is more of these sorts of dishes than you might imagine. Chimichangas were invented in Arizona. Spaghetti and meatballs probably come from New York. And California rolls are from, well, California. I did a couple other videos where I talked about this whole phenomena of made-up foreign foods. Now, a particularly fun example is the fortune cookie, which is not only a faux-authentic Chinese food, but a full-on faux-authentic Chinese tradition. As is so often the case, no one is able to speak with 100% certainty as to when fortune cookies first became a thing, but what everyone does seem to agree on is that they are a purely American invention that isn't actually found in Asia. Fortune cookies, like the Chinese gates, can be seen as an example of immigrants playing into a certain stereotype of themselves. In this case, the idea of the mysterious fortune-telling Oriental. As a result, some Asian Americans may even regard them as an offensive anachronism from a more condescending age. I remember the Ben & Jerry's people had to apologize after putting fortune cookie pieces in their Jeremy Lin-themed ice cream. You see a similar growing backlash to some of the other Orientalist imagery that was often used to market Chinese stuff to white Americans back in the day, such as this type of lettering, which is now often considered quite cringe, if not outright racist. Which brings us to the dark side of the faux-authentic phenomena. At what point do you cross the line from merely dreaming up new ideas inspired by a foreign culture and instead start pushing culturally ignorant nonsense that is only popular because it panders to shallow stereotypes? So I am sure I am just beginning to scratch the surface of this whole rich topic. Since I know I have such a wonderfully international audience, I'd be curious to know if any of you guys have any other good examples of American cultural practices that have a pretense of foreignness, but are really pretty far removed from the country they supposedly come from, or maybe even in the opposite direction as well. I've been around the world enough to know that there is plenty of stuff that foreign countries market as authentically American that has very little resemblance to anything found in actual American culture. But let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.